All right, let's get into this. In the studio, we've got the Athletics' Nick Miller. We've also got Daniel Taylor, Tim Spears, and of course, David Ornstein, just to break things up as they like to do it here on the Athletic Football Podcast. Right, let's break this down. Steve Cooper's gone. He's left Nottingham Forest. Are we surprised that it's taken the chairman this long to part ways with Steve Cooper?
Yeah, I think everyone was a little bit surprised. I mean, just in general, it feels like it's been a couple of weeks away from happening for, better part of a year. Obviously lost 5-0 to Fulham a couple of weeks ago, and everyone in the way end at that game seemed to feel like it was the end, and not unsurprisingly at that point. There was about sort of 10-15 minutes in the second half where sort of either side of the fourth goal, I think it was, Forest fans were just singing Cooper's name throughout, and it was a kind of embarrassing performance, but it felt like it was 3,000 people saying goodbye to him, and then at the end of the game he came and waved, and everyone assumed that the following day you'd get the old corner flag picture on Twitter, and he's stayed for another couple of weeks, which is, it sort of dragged it out a little bit, but is also, I don't know, having that time where we've all sort of assumed it was going to happen is in some ways been quite nice to just kind of fully appreciate this guy that's been there for 2 years and has been so significant for Forest.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, Daniel. I mean, like, he's got his army of fans, hasn't he? Like, Forest fans absolutely love this guy.
Yeah, and it's going to be really weird without him in one sense. I do think that Nuno's going to need to get a good start, because the mood could go downhill rapidly, I fear. Obviously, his first game will be Bournemouth on Saturday, which is, Bournemouth at home. It's the sort of game that they'd be hoping to win. But then after that, they've got Newcastle away and Man United at home. And I just feel like without Steve, everyone's complimented Forest on what a great atmosphere it is, and how, every game the fans are up for it, and the City Ground, it's just louder than even, the years when they were winning the European Cups, and etc., etc. I just feel like that there's a risk that with Steve Cooper no longer there, and yeah, as you say, you can't really, it's very rare to have that connection between a crowd and the football manager, and without that, it's slightly unsettling in one way, just to sort of wonder what it's going to be like on Saturday. What if they go a goal behind? What if it's a nervous performance? What if they lose? Basically, how are the crowd going to react? I mean, results changed everything, don't they? So if they win on Saturday, then all of a sudden the fans will be talking about Nuno in a much more positive light than perhaps they are at the moment, where it's very divided from what I've seen online. And it's just, I suppose it's just a bit of uncertainty really. Whereas when Steve Cooper was there, the Forest fans sort of felt like they had this kind of guy who was, I know it sounds a bit cliched, but who was their leader. They identified with him. There was a proper connection. As I say, a rare connection. And every football fan wants that, don't they, with their manager? And so now that's gone, I feel, like people are genuinely quite bereft. I've brought up my son in Manchester to be a Forest fan, which wasn't particularly easy. It's involved a lot of brainwashing, and I've obviously basically kind of been telling him for weeks now, and sort of since the start of the season that things aren't good, and and basically certainly in the last few weeks that be prepared for me telling you that Steve Cooper's going to be on his way. And when I actually told him yesterday, I was really quite surprised by because he looked just genuinely bereft. And he just turned 15 last week, and I was kind of expecting him just to kind of shrug it off. But it was it's sort of one of those moments that brought it home. When I take away my own, put my fan hat on, I suppose, rather than being a journalist for a second, it just feel like a lot of people are genuinely quite upset to lose such a person, because they're rare. Forest have waited quarter of a century to have a manager like Steve Cooper.
Yeah, as an outsider, I really grasp this sense of it being the end of an era, and a quite spectacular, historic one, from where Steve Cooper inherited Nottingham Forest, languishing at the bottom of the Championship, and bringing them up to the Premier League. And some of the scenes are just unforgettable, and will leave an indelible mark on the lives of so many people who experience them. So I was at the Arsenal game towards the end of last season when Forest secured their survival in the Premier League. And I don't think I've seen noise like it at a Premier League game maybe ever. It was ear-splitting from Mull of Kintyre pre-match all the way through to the scenes on the pitch at the end, and it became a bit of a religious experience. This club really has risen up, been reawoken by Steve Cooper, and let's take nothing away from the investment for sure of the ownership, because that's something I'm sure we'll come on to talk about more. But together and in this quite uncomfortable relationship, they've sort of struck upon a good thing. And so it's quite interesting listening to the likes of Nick and Danny on the sort of emotion involved, because Steve Cooper really has captured the Forest fan base. And I think maybe he, from what we've seen of him in his career, will be quite philosophical about this. It's come to a bit of a natural end. He'll go on to have a great career. It was extremely challenging. It was probably worse behind the scenes than we've seen on the surface. But it will be quite bizarre to watch Nuno Espírito Santo leading them forward. And I don't know how much the atmosphere actually drove the team on and was a key factor in what we've seen up until this point. And if that is not sort of recaptured by the fans going forward, whether it has a detrimental effect on Nuno's time as manager. And we know this is an owner, as Danny's big piece on The Athletic today lays out. I think he's had 6 managerial changes in 16 months at Olympiacos. He's far more known for hiring and firing of managers than we've seen at Forest in recent times. We did see it at Forest previously. And so we're entering a critical period now. Perhaps this is the best time to be in the Premier League. If you're just above those bottom teams, people think immediately of sort of a Sheffield United, a Luton Town, although they've shown signs of being able to do something more than people expected, maybe Burnley too. And so they'll hope that their survival can be maintained. They've got enough quality at the club. But this is a really big decision. And clearly with many of the fans, it hasn't gone down well. But Mr. Marinakis, Evangelos Marinakis, the owner, has invested enough to feel he has the right to do this, and many fans would agree with that.
Yeah, I tell you what, I want to talk about Marinakis, who's quite a special character from your reporting, Danny, and also Nick as well. But just give me a second because I feel like we're talking about Steve Cooper like he's died. I feel like the heart's been ripped out of Nottingham Forest, but he's still very much alive, listeners. But just especially if you're not a Forest fan, give us a sense of just how much his legacy at Forest is for Forest fans, because Brian Clough historically is the coach that everyone knows is identified with Nottingham Forest, European success and also great success elsewhere. But since then, you probably say he's really the icon at Nottingham Forest.
Yeah, I mean the other one would be Frank Clark, who took Forest from the second division to Europe in 2 years. And it is a little bit harsh that people sort of almost tend to forget about him after. But it was the 23 years away from being in the Premier League. For a lot of that time, Forest, they got relegated to League One and they could have had a couple of scrapes of relegation. But for a lot of that time, Forest weren't awful. They were just nothing. It was just this kind of long stretches of ennui that.
I love that word.
Ennui. where it was just very difficult to get excited or kind of inspire any kind of emotion either way, really. And it was there was a real sort of low point when just before Steve Cooper took over, and more or less from the first game, there were things to be excited about again. And winning games is obviously it's pointless to kind of pretend that everyone would still have this great affection for Steve Cooper if he wasn't successful and didn't get Forest promoted. But that build-up of 23 years of frustration, then with someone who was successful, only really missed out on automatic promotion a little bit from coming in when Forest were bottom of the Championship. So there's the on the pitch success is one thing, but the kind of the idea of him. You'll see kind of loads and loads of stories about Cooper basically doing things that he didn't need to do, but that endeared him to the Forest fans and the city. So there was a great story that was going round last night about this head teacher in Nottingham somewhere who got a call from the reception saying there's a guy called Steve in reception for you.
It wasn't Cooper, was
and it was him.
No way.
It was Cooper, because he'd heard about this head teacher who had been talking about Forest, and there was a Forest display on the wall. He'd heard about this, and he just kind of popped in to say hello and to thank them for their support. You'll have seen, if you ever watch any Forest games, you'll have seen the kind of banners and tifos and stuff in the Trent end. The group that mostly put those together, called Forza Garibaldi, it takes a lot of work to do all that, to kind of prepare all the banners and the everything, put everything on the seats and stuff, which they do before a game. They would quite often, be trudging across the car park after a long day's, banner preparing, and Steve Cooper would be there and would sort of thank them for their support. It's just all sort of things like that, which, coupled with the success on the pitch and the giving fans something to be excited about after 23 years of mostly nothingness. That's why he was so loved, and that's what the kind of legacy he'll lead.
Yeah, wonderful eulogy. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. But yeah, crucially, he is still alive.
Danny, let's get into Marinakis, because in terms of the relationship between Cooper and the owner of the club, I was reading your piece. It's fair to say it's rather fraught relationship, and it always has been in a very strange way.
Well, funnily enough, yesterday and I think this again, just to go back to what Nick's saying about the measure of the man. So Steve Cooper was told the news by another member of staff yesterday, and he also, he knew that Nuno was in the building and between the training ground and the stadium, and it was all sort of very strategically done to keep the two of them apart. So even in these sort of circumstances, basically he and Marinakis, the relationship was broken. It's been broken for a long, long time. If I'm honest, what I've written today is 2% of the truth.
Really?
There's so many stories and so much background to it, and a lot of it is unpleasantness, and a lot of it is fractious and just not what you really want at a football club. And a lot of it's quite mystifying as well, because you kind of think like, well, if you're lucky enough to have a manager like Steve Cooper, then because it's not, this doesn't just apply to the recent run where we've had one win in 13 games. This goes back much longer. So anyway, so last night it did actually end in Steve Cooper going into the boardroom at Forest and basically having an amicable chat with the owner and shaking hands, agreeing that it'd been, they'd enjoyed some good times together and kind of leaving it in a very sort of grown up kind of way. Whereas, I think a few other people would have certainly been very offended and put out to find, to wake up to knowing that there's another guy flying in to take your job. Steve and a lot of people around him felt that there'd been some pretty underhand things happening, stories appearing in the media, all sort of seemed to be designed to undermine him, and just as I say, various bits of unpleasantness. It's just a very it is a very hard-faced environment, and they make no apologies for that. And that is, and I think basically, I say that almost without criticism, because I think by now I've kind of just got used to the idea that it's great that they put the investment in and the ambition. And if you remember back to the previous owner, who had neither proper investment or proper ambition, or he had ambition, but it was kind of like a fantasy land ambition, then it's great. Everyone welcomes this. It's just basically for that, the price of that, in a way, is that you have to understand that Forest is going to be run in a certain way that is not what we're really used to. It's far more what they're obviously used to at Olympiacos and that involves, it involves quite hostile. It can be quite hostile. There can be explosions of temper. There can be staff who are almost, living in fear of. I went to Athens once. I remember basically, I was in the building, and then there was a female member of staff who suddenly realised that she was wearing the wrong colours, because Mr. Marinakis doesn't like anyone wearing purple because he thinks it's unlucky, and he doesn't like anyone wearing green because it's, the colour of one of their rivals. And so I think she had, I don't know, like a purple top on or something. And the panic on this woman's face, there was this kind of like desperation to not displease the owner, who despite the fact he, is flying between two different countries and has two different clubs, he takes incredibly hands-on role, right down to what goes out on social media. And he ultimately just didn't share the fans' enthusiasm for Steve Cooper, and he thought that the praise was over the top, bearing in mind what had happened in the 18 months in the Premier League. He couldn't understand how someone that was involved in a relegation fight could get all these, these songs and the adulation that Steve Cooper got, and basically he resented it. I think, and that's not just me who thinks that.
No, but I hear you. But he could. I mean, I'm just sort of playing devil's advocate here. This is a guy who's won 10 out of 12, trophies or whatever, Olympiacos. He's probably got a thing in his head, thinking, well, I've proven that I can do this. And this is how I work. So if you're not going to play by my rules, see you later. I mean,
exactly. And what he's done in Greece, it stands up for him and it works. And people are used to that regime. It's just taken a bit of getting used to. And listen, the people that run Forest will admit there have been significant cultural differences between how they run Olympiacos and how they run Forest. And so basically, shouting at people in England doesn't necessarily is sort of something that was a little bit consigned to the past. These kind of like very kind of like old school football kind of thing of just basically, if they lose, it's fury and just basically, and a part of me kind of like really, the expectations and the ambitions are really impressive, but there's just basically it's undone by, they've spent so much money, and you just kind of think, look, just got to be a little bit, got to be a little bit wiser sometimes, and a bit more emotional support for the manager, and just it doesn't always work. This kind of like angry scenes that do occur, and there's all sorts of. I mean, there's recruitment and all sorts of stuff that could be done. So we could talk about recruitment for the next hour. There's all sorts of stuff, that just kind of like slightly unorthodox. Like his son is effectively the de facto sporting director. 24-year-old guy. Might be a very intelligent guy, or he might eventually, be very good at this. But it's just, there are some horror stories along the way. A lot of people leave Forest feeling incredibly bruised. I think Steve Cooper will feel pretty raw, even if it did end in a handshake. There's been some pretty, like I say, unpleasant. I think is probably the best way to say it. So.
Yeah, David, I know you're chomping at the bit to come in. What you got?
Well, Danny uses the word raw there, but I also think many will feel that Steve Cooper's better off out of there, given the environment that he was working within. And I think Danny's being quite polite at times and scratching at the surface, because when you speak to people around the industry, they describe it as being pretty toxic and volatile and like tempestuous, and again, I think that's quite a polite way of putting it at times. This is just the way that Evangelos Marinakis seems to work and to run Forest and behave. And in Danny's piece, he talks of like the expectations of where he wants to get to with Forest, and he will be of the view that he's brought in a quality and a number of players that should have produced better results and performances. And at times, Steve Cooper, in the early Premier League days, I think was relying on quite a lot of the players who got him up from the Championship and a British core, whereas I think the owner would have liked to have seen many of the newer signings integrated. And I don't think we've really paused to quite realise and appreciate just how difficult that must have been for everybody at Forest. They are unprecedented numbers of signings. A £250 million spend is probably unprecedented for a team at that level. Of course, we've seen higher teams spend bigger amounts, but the numbers in and out, that's just in the playing squad. And on the last transfer deadline day, it was another 5, or something like that. And players turning up at training camps. I remember the summer before last. It was just like, who's coming in next, and who's recruited this player, and where do they fit into the style and the system and the group and the dynamic and behaviourally. And I don't mean this in insulting way, but it seemed from the outside to be carnage in the transfer market. And that's not conducive to settled training sessions, let alone preparation for matches and tactics. And the more you think about it, it just seems an extraordinary state of affairs that we've just lived through in many forms, and not just in terms of the playing personnel, but the staff too. So there have been changes at sporting director level, at chairman level. There have been, the set piece coach, even right down to a discrepancy over who that would be, and an appointment has now come in that I think was led by Steve Cooper and now remains at the club in his absence, and there will be staff who now go. So also spare a thought for the players. I mean, Steve Cooper, by all intents and purposes, is going to go on and continue to have a career at the top level, and I don't think he will be short of offers, which is a measure of the regard in which he's held. He has done well in club football, he's done well in international football with the England youth setup, and it wouldn't surprise me if he takes another step forward in his career relatively soon. But that Forest project does seem to be on pretty delicate ground, and maybe that is the way that Marinakis runs it, and you've got to lump it or leave it.
Yeah, very quickly on that, Nick. You look at a guy who's had 20 different managers, 14 with Olympiacos, 6 with Forest, and you look at his first summer. Olympiacos has funded 19 new signings while he was there, but also look at the signings he made in the Premier League. I mean, there's a whole heap of players that have come in to Forest. I mean, a bit like the Chelsea situation. Could you even cram them all into the changing room? But there's a clear pattern here of a guy who likes to spend to get what he wants, but then we're looking at FFP, we're looking at so many things. Does he manage to balance the books as well? Like, especially at Forest?
Well, I mean, balancing the books is a problem that is kind of going to come down the line in a year or two. No idea really. But yeah, it's just the as kind of Danny and David have alluded to. It's the ambition is great, but it's just how that ambition is sort of channeled. There doesn't seem to, there seems to be kind of 3 or 4 different plans that are sort of mushed together, which is kind of reflective of the number of people who are making the signings. They've recruited a couple of promising young players from South America, who the idea being presumably to kind of sell on for more money, and then they've made some kind of free transfers that you'd think that's a kind of shrewd signing that a club on a kind of real budget might sign. And then there were a bunch of players that brought in from the Bundesliga who were apparently based on a lot of kind of data that went into the recruitment of those players. So all of those things are fine, but when you kind of throw them all together, it just becomes very kind of confused. And there are, as the guys have said, different people recruiting different players, and yeah, you would just like it to be a little bit more focused.
Just a tiny addition: it's not just the personnel that has been upgraded or being in need of upgrade, but also the facilities. I've spoken to a couple of people at Forest that say this is like a mid-championship level structure and infrastructures and physical and sort of technical, the data, the scouting, the analysis, the sports science. This is a team that was out of the Premier League for 23 years. So they're still in the process of trying to bring the training ground, the stadium up to the modern level, and some of those crucial things behind the scenes that make so many of these clubs at the forefront and sing and dance in a way that is fit for purpose in 2024 now coming up to in the Premier League are not there at Forest, and that is another area of improvement that's needed, even though it gets a lot less attention.
Yeah, Danny, I'm talking about all this spending, right? And look, yeah, Forest got promoted, but they're not winning much, commercially. You can't see where the money's coming in necessarily. Is he able to manage that debt well? Because the Premier, look at what's happened to Everton, look at what's happened to various clubs. The Premier League will be looking at this.
Yeah, of course they will. But to be fair, I think they basically this was the reason why they sold Brennan Johnson. Basically, I mean, my biggest issue is that, well, just look, maybe they wouldn't have had to sell Brennan Johnson if they'd been a little bit wiser in terms of they've awarded some huge contracts to players in their 30s who end up. Forest always seem to have a bomb squad at sort of some level or another. The Harry Arter situation, is another. Paying a guy whatever it is X million a year to basically, just basically sit around and do nothing, and it's kind of like, there's an anger towards the player from the club side, but actually, if you detach yourself from it, you think, well, you are the employer, you are the people that have written out these contracts, So even someone like Steve Cook, who don't get me wrong, did a great job for Forest, popular with the fans, and if he ever came back to Forest, would be applauded, but on every side of the ground, But basically, they gave him a contract of like £40,000 a week, and so basically, when he's out of the team, then all of a sudden you're looking at £2 million a year, and he's got a 3-year contract, and it's just kind of this really strange lack of joined up thinking sometimes. So many of these players just pass through. This goes back to the last 6 or 7 years basically. And you just think, God, they have wasted an absolute fortune, and it has it has an effect for the fans as well. Ticket prices have rocketed. You have to pay for big membership fees these days and all sorts of stuff, because of course they're concerned about FFP. They had to move out Brennan Johnson because of that reason. So yeah, it is a concern. I mean, to be fair to them, I think they'll be okay, but yeah, it's going to be borderline, and. It does make you wonder about the levels of expenditure that they'll be able to make in the next few years. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of money coming into the club. It's a concern. I wouldn't list it at the top of my concerns if I'm honest. But yeah,
no, I don't know if it was you who wrote it, but it's talking about how he's reduced the club's debt by converting £11 million into loans and into shares. £11 million of loans, I should say, into shares for the financial year 22-23. Does he do those kind of things to kind of balance the books in a sense?
This again comes back to the good point. So this is a guy with big pockets, deep pockets. Mm-hmm. They always make sure that these stories come out, and it's very brilliantly timed just before Steve Cooper goes. There's all sorts of games going on in the background that people sometimes aren't aware of. But it's but ultimately this is the side that the fans have to be grateful for. He is funding the club to a level it hasn't been funded before. That has to be the case if he wants to meet his expectations. There isn't a club in the Premier League though they're not putting in, big money, with perhaps the exception of a couple in the relegation places. But if he wants to be a top 10 club, which is his ambition, then he's going to have to do that. But he also needs a little bit of realism and patience sometimes, because just look at Aston Villa and how many years they spent. Look at Brighton. Before Brighton became what they are now, they had 4 or 5 seasons in the zone that I think Forest realistically should be aiming for now, which isn't trying to be a top 10 side now, because basically top 10 from where we were last season. Where if we're really honest, Forest were quite lucky in a few games last season. I'm thinking West Ham at home, thinking Liverpool at home. Just Man City at home, where Haaland probably missed more chances than he would ever miss in any game. We picked up a few points where quite easily we could have lost all those games. Whereas there aren't that many games that we won that we lost, where you think that was really, really unfortunate. So I think we played at our max last season. So to think this idea that we can be top 10, which basically means like getting another 10 to 14 points, overtaking the likes of Brentford and Fulham and West Ham and all these clubs that are a bit more established, you just have to sometimes temper with a bit more realism. So I think far more realistic is that we also don't have the biggest wage bill in the league, by the way, by a long, long distance. We might have spent a lot of money, but what have the other clubs done? What have Fulham done over a long period of time? And, what have Aston Villa done? They've spent fortunes. So, we realistically, to me, are a team that should be aiming for kind of like 11th to 15th, which is kind of like, the Brighton zone until they were able to step up. It's just, maybe I'm not as maybe that would be scorned by certain people within the City ground, and that shows that what they think is low self-esteem for the club. And I think personally it's realistic. I think Steve Cooper probably thought that was realistic, and I think most people in football would. But equally, it's not our name above the door. So, like I said, coming to my earlier point, you just have to understand that for the money, you have to understand that this is the way the club's going to be run. And it is, a bit like David said, you like it or lump it, because that's what it is. It's not going to change. They're not going to, they're not going to suddenly, pull back and completely change the way they are.
One interesting point on what Danny said there is how they operate in the market moving forward. So I think the sale of Brennan Johnson for around £50 million has drawn a bit of a line in the sand. It's put down a marker that Forest can trade in the other direction as well, which would have been a huge boost for them on their financial fair play situation. And now they've got a couple of assets too. If you look at, say, Murillo, who is being talked about quite heavily, Morgan Gibbs-White as well. We've known them only sort of operating in one direction largely over the last couple of years. But let's see if when Danny references the likes of Brighton and others, they trade outwards to it. And that could, in theory, if things calm down a bit, see Forest become a bit more sustainable financially. And that recent investment by Marinakis, or conversion of debt into shares, is not the first time he's done that. I think it's happened 3 or 4 times before. So there is a financial concern here, and it can't really continue in that way unless he wants to keep bankrolling it and that's at his own expense, which is obviously a financial fair play concern.
Funny, I mean, Danilo's another one, David, as well, that they signed, and I was, they were, I know they got inquiries even last summer when he hadn't been there very long. And Gibbs-White's a funny one because he is probably the team's best player. But I was, I went to the Wolves Forest match recently with some people from Wolves, and we were discussing him and how highly they rate him, and ultimately he has to improve his stats, I think, to be a proper elite player. He his goals and assists. So I'm not totally sure that there would be a bit of buy for him at the moment. I would say, if you look at his stats against someone like James Maddison, for example, he's quite a long way behind in terms of like assists, goals that Maddison was with Leicester. So I do think maybe Danilo was the one that they were looking at, but then I think that's possibly being overtaken by Murillo, who does genuinely look like the real deal. He's the type of player I'd imagine. I don't want to make any silly statements here, but I imagine that he's the type of player that someone like Pep Guardiola would love. A brilliant passer of the ball, playing out of defence, left-footed centre half, which people always like, and just he could be playing any position on the pitch. Really, he's so comfortable. He still makes mistakes, but I do think that he is. I'm getting really ahead of myself, but he to me looks like a potential 75-80 million pound player in the making.
David, obviously, they would have been searching far and wide to see who they could bring in. Nuno Espírito Santo, I feel like, has divided opinion in so many ways. Who else would have been in the frame for this job?
Well, they would have been looking into this, the ownership at Forest, more than a year ago, because Steve Cooper returned some bad results. I remember there was a brutal evening at Leicester when a number of people thought that he was, to quote sources, a dead man walking and about to get sacked. He ended up getting a new contract. And in that kind of environment, if you're any club, would be looking into contingency plans. He signed a new contract, which, by the way, and we didn't mention this earlier, was probably crucial for him and his family in terms of the security that it provided them and will do going forward. But knowing the way in which Marinakis operates and hires and fires managers, more so as we've discussed at Olympiacos than Nottingham Forest of late, he will always be having conversations with agents, representatives, people across the game, and deploying his staff to do their analysis and keep an eye on candidates. And so very quickly you heard names like Oliver Glasner, who had done very well at Eintracht Frankfurt and is available. Perhaps the appeal of somebody like him, or Julian Lopetegui, who came to the fore, and there seem to have been some conversations because he was available too, and that might appeal from a financial perspective. You don't have to pay to get someone out of their contract, and they'd be ready to go. But ultimately, it seems to have gone the way of Nuno for multiple reasons, and you would assume the job that he did in his earlier days at Wolves was attractive. There's a good relationship with his representative, George Mendes, who has been involved in a number of the player transfers into Nottingham Forest, and Mendes does not represent those other candidates we mentioned there. But obviously it didn't end well at Wolves at all. It didn't go well at Tottenham at all. That was actually quite a protracted appointment at Tottenham, and we were prepared for this one to drag on a little bit. It got quite difficult around his, I think, some backroom staff, the contract. That didn't end up replicating itself here. Forest have got him in, and he's already leading training in preparation for a crucial run of matches. But whether that was the right decision or not, we're going to have to wait and see. They've got a highly regarded sporting director in Ross Wilson, who will be involved in at least the conversations, the analysis around this sort of thing. But we don't know how much autonomy all of these people at Forest get, because we know who the boss is.
Yeah, for sure. Well, David, we're going to have to let you go. We've squeezed you dry of transfer information. And I know it's heading into silly season for you right now. All the transfers, January's on its way. So please leave us and go get some rest if you can.
I will. Thanks, guys.
All right, Tim, let's bring you in here. And I know you've definitely been around Nuno from the Wolves days and also Spurs days as well. And we look at him being in the Saudi Pro League. And I know he won the championship, but consequently has been relieved of his duties. Some might look at this as a bit of an uninspired signing. Is that just for Nuno? Because everyone deserves to prove themselves, don't they? Regardless of what public rhetoric might dictate.
Yeah, of course. I mean, he's been a manager for more than 10 years now, and there is a little bit of recency bias in terms of his reputation, which of course took a hit at Spurs over what was a very short period of time, 17 games, in difficult circumstances, with Harry Kane wanting to leave to Man City or close to leaving for Man City that summer, and he was way down the list in terms of the Spurs pecking order. You know, they had a host of managers turn them down that summer, so it was difficult for him to command the respect of a potentially difficult dressing room with a lot of characters in there, which he struggled with. I think it was probably a little bit too big for him. But if you look at some of the other work he's done in his career, even before Wolves, he took a little Portuguese club called Rio Ave to Europe for the first time in their whole history. He took Valencia to fourth in their league at a time when it wasn't common for them to do that. Porto, he did okay, finished second. And then the job he did at Wolves was utterly phenomenal, to be honest. He created one of the best teams in Championship history, I would say. And that's not me as with my Wolves hat on saying that. And they were highly regarded as one of the most stylish and best teams. And again, I think there's recency bias in that, it ended badly for him at Wolves. And there was some dour football in that last season, which was the pandemic season, which he personally really struggled with. But before that, Wolves played some incredible, intoxicating, exhilarating football, certainly the best I've ever seen at Molineux. And also, the bond that he generated with the fans and the city there was unlike anything I've ever seen. There was a real cult around him, this sort of mythical beard-stroking philosopher. They adored him. There was like graffiti of him, like plastered around the city. Yeah. They were in tears when he left. He was in tears when he left. But the thing about the Forest job is it's going to be under very different circumstances. He had a clean slate at Wolves for him and George Mendes to build a team together. It's not going to be the case at Forest. But what he can do, he can organise a team. He's very good defensively. He's quite pragmatic. He can really set a team out. He's had a very good career with success at almost everywhere that he's been, which does bode well for Forest. And he's done things that Cooper hasn't done in his career, which is perhaps what they're looking at. He's taken teams into Europe. He's won titles. He took Wolves to 7th place 2 seasons in a row and to Europa League quarter-final, which is like a phenomenal job, which was only sort of 3 years ago.
Nick, I mean, from a Forest perspective, the CV sounds amazing, by the way, Tim. I'm not, you hear that and you're thinking, okay, maybe the chairman, the owner's got a little something up his sleeve here, but maybe it's just me. But when I heard that name, I wasn't thinking, oh, wow, this is going to be the next level. But also, if we look ahead, and especially the ambition that Forest have, is he the one to take them to 6th, 7th, and then potentially challenge that, 4th spot or whatever? I mean, like it's quite a gamble.
Steady on, my God. Forest are 17th in the table. Somebody got challenging for the championship.
But I mean, from the chairman, from the owner,
no,
this is the
I see
kind
what
of
you're
rhetoric
saying.
that's coming out.
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to say. I mean, I think the reaction from Forest fans has been quite underwhelmed, and I think a lot of that is informed by, as Tim, as Tim's spoken about, the what happened at Spurs. I think for fairly or not, people sort of disregard whatever he might have done in Saudi Arabia, and there was the as David mentioned earlier on, a couple of slightly or perceived to be sexier names were sort of dangled in Lopetegui and Glasner, but the kind of they might be unfair reservations, but I think that the more kind of considered caveats might be, as Tim mentioned, it was a particular set of circumstances at Wolves which kind of allowed him to succeed. He was able to build that team, and in the Championship had an awful lot of players who probably shouldn't be playing in the Championship, who were kind of above that level, and then was able to take that team into the Premier League. Here he will have to, with Forest, he'll have to deal with a very big squad, a squad that has it feels quite unbalanced. A lot of ball-winning central midfielders and not much creativity. Doesn't really have a kind of striker that anyone trusts at the moment, with Taiwo Awoniyi injured until the new year. So then he is he's following what he had at Wolves. This is the obvious point that he was the hero at Wolves, Cooper's the hero at Forest, and he's now got to follow that. He has his first game is at home to Bournemouth, who I think people will perceive that as kind of a winnable game, but Bournemouth are obviously playing really well at the moment. There's then Newcastle and Manchester United after that, so he's got a tricky old start.
He's got 2 away games and then a home game against Manchester United. Wow.
Well, but Bournemouth is at home, but he's got a couple of home games, so which is kind of promising. But I think he'll have to. There won't be as much patience sort of extended to him by the fans, which is probably very unfair on him, but it's kind of inevitable given who he's following. So he'll need a good start.
Tim, I'm just back to the Nuno conversation. We're talking about this environment that he's entering, right? Hiring, firing, harsh, some might say toxic. Is this a guy that's built for that environment?
He worked at Valencia at a really tough time in the mid sort of 2000s and 10s. What do we call that? Do you know what I mean?
I know what you mean.
It was around 2015. And he was basically told, you've got to finish 4th. That's your job. You've got to finish 4th. And that's they were like the ultimate higher fire club. I think Gary Neville came in sort of shortly after that. So he's used to pressure. Porto as well, huge pressure to win every single match you play. He's used to that. He won't worry about that at all. But one thing he will need is control. That's what he had at Wolves with Mendes, and that relationship is so important. Like, these guys are best friends. He's not just a client of George Mendes. He was George Mendes' first client 2 decades ago, and they are best friends. And they work very closely, obviously very well together. When it comes to January, if there's a Mendes client knocking around,
you won't be surprised.
Needs a new, he'll do his friend favours. Of course he will. So that was a hugely important link at Wolves. That's why Ruben Neves moved to the Championship from the Champions League, and Diogo Jota moved to the Championship from the Champions League. He can pull rabbits out of hats, and recruitment was a massive part of Wolves' success. So one thing he doesn't like, which should be pointed out, is being challenged. And you mentioned Saudi Arabia. There was rumours of a falling out with Karim Benzema, which I wouldn't be surprised at all. At Wolves, and again, this sort of goes against what's happening at Forest. He likes a small, tight squad of sort of trusted players, and he doesn't like if there's egos and people challenging him, they're out the door. One of his old players told me once that you don't go knocking on Nuno's door.
Oh goodness!
You just don't do it. If you're out the team, you want to know why. You don't dare go knocking on that door, because he will just tell you where to go. He'll be like, "Well, you should know why you're not in the team. Work harder in training, you idiot." So he's a huge personality, It's not always there on the camera. He does turn on the charm for the camera, but he can be horrible. He said himself he can be the worst person in the world, with his moods and his anger. I can vouch for that.
Wow.
You know,
Cool.
Get ready, Forest.
No, but along the same lines, he really owns a room. He is the boss. He can be very charismatic.
Yeah.
You know, he can really. He can make you feel like the smallest person in the room, the way he speaks to you. And then the next day, it'll be big bear hugs and, how's it going, with his big smile. So, yeah, he's quite a complex character, sort of an angry introvert. He's actually quite shy. There's a lot to him, but if he'll need results, of course, but if he gets that, the Forest fans could grow to love him like the Wolves fans did.
Yeah. I mean, that is going to be quite, not so much for the fans, but for the players, it's going to be quite a shift from Cooper, who was very much, doors always open guy. There were all these stories about him sort of constantly FaceTiming players when they weren't, when on their days off and stuff, just to see what they're up to, just to get to know them, to the point where it sounded quite irritating at some points. But he was very kind of, a lot of his strength was that he was a good guy who got on with most people, particularly most of the players. And that was sort of one of the signals that it was all coming to an end when he started falling out with a few players. So going from managerial appointments are often a reaction to the previous guy. So there is an element of logic to that, but it will be fascinating to see how a lot of the Forest players adapt to this sort of slightly more, as Tim says, complex character.
Well, you just got to roll with it. Sometimes he wouldn't talk to players for days and they wouldn't know why. And then the next time it's all bear hugs. He's big into hugging. That's one of the reasons he hates the pandemic, because he's big into like physical contact and
That's why I get so angry. I haven't touched anyone today.
There's a lot to him, but it could be a bit of a culture shock for some of the Forest players after following on from Cooper.
I mean, it almost sounds like Forest are becoming a corporate club, dare I say.
Good Lord.
Anyway, let's finish on this. Yeah, huge injuries already. Look at AFCON. Several players are going to be leaving. So, got a depleted squad. He's not walking into the easiest circumstances. In the short term, survival surely is the only thing you can really think about now, and then anything else on top is a bonus.
Logically, yeah. I mean, it just there is a sort of, as Danny mentioned earlier on, there is possibly a little gap between the expectation of the ownership and what is realistic and what is sensible for this season. I think from this point, most Forest fans would take 17th place, but who knows really? I think that would be the realistic target for this season. If, as Tim says, if he can tighten the defence up, make Forest a bit more solid. One of the problems that Forest have had this season is taking leads and then immediately throwing them away. So if he can stop them doing that, then that would be great. He as you say, there's an issue with quite a few players are going to be disappearing to AFCON in January, and as you say, it's a very difficult circumstance for him to come into. Whether he will actually make sense of this kind of slightly chaotic club, who knows really.
Yeah, well, let's finish there. I want to say thank you to Tim for coming in last minute. Also Danny, Nick as well, good to have you, and also David as well. Remember, you can rate and review the podcast if you're enjoying it. One year subscription is at the special discounted price of $19.99 a month. That's both dollars and pounds. Simply head over to theathletic.com/footballpod. Thank you so much for listening. We're back tomorrow. If you like this video, click subscribe for more content like this. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season to bring you the inside track to the biggest stories in football. If you'd like to listen to the full episodes for free, search the Athletic Football Podcast wherever you get your podcasts from.